The amphitheatre at midday was nearly empty of nobles, for the morning's beast hunts had ended and the executions had not yet begun, and the seats reserved for senators stood vacant under the white sun. Seneca, returning from some errand in the city, found himself drawn into the upper tiers by the noise, and he sat for a time among the common spectators, watching what they watched. By the time he reached his writing table that evening, his hand was unsteady, and he wrote to his friend Lucilius that he had returned home greedier, more ambitious, more given to luxury, and crueler, and more inhuman, because he had been among men. That sentence sits at the head of the 7th letter to Lucilius, and it is one of the strangest admissions any moral teacher of antiquity ever made about himself. A man who had advised emperors, who had written volumes on anger and on the happy life and on the constancy of the wise man, confesses that a single afternoon in a crowd has undone him, not corrupted him in any dramatic way, not driven him to crime, simply softened him, coarsened him, made him a little more like the people he had been sitting beside. He went home, and he was less than he had been when he left. This is the principle the 7th letter sets before you, and it is the principle we will sit with together for the next half hour or so. Seneca calls it, in his Latin, the danger of mingling with the multitude. Gummere, in the old translation we will follow throughout, renders the warning plainly. To consort with the crowd is harmful. There is no person who does not make some vice attractive to us, or stamp it upon us, or taint us unconsciously therewith. That last word is the one to hold, unconsciously, without your knowing, without your consent. The crowd, Seneca says, does not argue you into vice. It does not present a case. It simply surrounds you, and you absorb what surrounds you, the way a cloth absorbs the smoke of the room it has hung in. You may have noticed in your own life that you return from certain gatherings diminished, not always after the obvious offenses. Sometimes after evenings that seemed pleasant enough, conversations that seemed harmless enough, and yet something in you has been narrowed. Some judgment you held the day before has loosened. Some standard you kept has slipped a notch, and you cannot quite name when it slipped, only that when you sit down again in solitude, you find yourself reaching for what you would not have reached for the day before. This is what Seneca is describing. He is not describing scandal. He is describing seepage, and the seepage runs in a particular direction. It runs downward. The crowd does not, as a rule, elevate the man who enters it. The crowd absorbs him. Seneca puts the matter without flattery to himself. Certainly, he writes, the greater the mob with which we mingle, the greater the danger. Not because crowds are evil in some metaphysical sense, but because crowds operate by a kind of averaging, and the average of any large gathering of human beings is not the height of human character. It is the floor, or near it. To stand in the crowd is to be slowly leveled toward that floor. One must consider what this letter is, and to whom it is written, before we go further. Lucilius Jr. was a younger friend of Seneca's, a Roman of equestrian rank who served as procurator in various provinces, including Sicily, during the period when these letters were composed. He was, by all accounts, intelligent, ambitious, and still in the process of forming his philosophical commitments. Seneca writes to him, not as an oracle writes to a supplicant, but as an older man writes to a younger one whose progress he is invested in, and whose vulnerabilities he understands because they were once his own. The letters are not, in their final form, private correspondence in the modern sense. Seneca clearly intended them for publication, but they retain the texture of address. Each one begins with a small observation, a complaint, a piece of news, and then turns toward the philosophical point Seneca wishes to make. The seventh letter begins with the afternoon at the games. To understand why that afternoon shook him, one must understand what Seneca's circumstance was and what kind of man he had become by the time he wrote these letters down. He was by then in his 60s. He had survived a great deal. Born in Corduba in the Roman province of Hispania around the turn of the era, brought to Rome as a child, educated in rhetoric and in the philosophical schools that were available to a young man of means, he had risen through the courts and the Senate during the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula. He had nearly been put to death by Caligula on a whim, saved, the story goes, only because someone convinced the emperor that Seneca was consumptive and would die soon anyway. He had been exiled to Corsica by Claudius for 8 years, on charges most modern historians consider largely fabricated, involving an affair with the emperor's niece. He had been recalled at the urging of Agrippina to tutor her young son, Nero. And when that son became emperor, Seneca had served, for a time, as one of the two men who effectively governed the empire on the boy's behalf. He had grown enormously rich during these years. The sources put his fortune in the hundreds of millions of sesterces. He owned estates, vineyards, a famous villa at Nomentum. His enemies, and he had many, charged him with usury, with hypocrisy, with profiting from the very luxury he condemned in his treatises. Some of those charges had teeth. Seneca knew they had teeth. He defended himself in a treatise called On the Happy Life by arguing that the philosopher need not be poor in order to teach the unimportance of wealth, that he must only hold his wealth lightly, ready to surrender it at any moment. Whether this argument convinces you is a question for another episode. What matters here is that the man writing the letters to Lucilius is not a hermit. He is not a beggar in the agora. He is a former chief minister of a vast empire, living in semi-retirement after stepping back from public life around the year 62, when his influence over Nero had collapsed and the safest course was withdrawal. So when Seneca writes about the crowd, he is not writing as a man who has avoided crowds his entire life. He is writing as a man who has spent decades inside them, at every level. The crowd of the courts, the crowd of the Senate, the crowd of the imperial household, with its informants and its rivalries, the crowd of dinner parties at which one's words were repeated to the emperor by morning. He knows what it is to live in the constant company of other people, and he knows what that company does over years to a man's interior. The retirement years, the years in which the letters to Lucilius were written, were his attempt to undo some of that damage. He withdrew, as much as a man of his rank could withdraw, to his estates. He read, he wrote, he cultivated a small circle of correspondence. He prepared, though he did not yet know it would be quite so soon, for the death Nero would eventually demand of him in the year 65, when the Pisonian conspiracy was uncovered, and Seneca, whether or not he had been involved, was ordered to open his veins. The seventh letter belongs to these years of withdrawal. It is the letter of a man who has finally been able to step out of the crowd, and who, in stepping out, has begun to see what the crowd had been doing to him all those years. The afternoon at the amphitheater was not for him a casual outing. It was a kind of test. He returned to the city, he walked into the press of bodies in the upper tiers, and he discovered that even now, even after years of careful philosophical practice, the crowd still had its old power over him. He went home worse than he had come. Let us look more carefully at what he saw there, because the seventh letter is unusually specific about it. The midday programs at the amphitheater were not the famous spectacles of the morning, when wild animals fought trained hunters, or of the late afternoon, when celebrated gladiators were paired in single combat. The midday hour was reserved for the executions of condemned criminals, and in Seneca's account, these were not the relatively quick deaths of crucifixion or beheading. They were combats between men with no skill, no armor, and no possibility of survival. One man was driven into the sand with a sword. He was set against another condemned man who was also armed. They fought until one killed the other. Then the survivor, exhausted and wounded, was sent against a fresh opponent. The process continued until no one was left alive. The crowd, Seneca reports, called for it. Kill him, lash him, burn him. Why does he meet the sword in so cowardly a way? Why does he strike so feebly? Why doesn't he die game? The Latin in that passage is sharper than any English can quite render, and Gummere's translation, while old, preserves the shape of it. What Seneca heard around him in the seats of the amphitheater was not silence, not horror, not even the ordinary appetite for blood that one might expect at such a place. It was the crowd's voice complaining that the dying were not entertaining enough. They were not killing one another with sufficient flair. They were not, in dying, providing what the audience had come to be provided with. And Seneca's confession in the letter is not, as one might expect from a moralist, that he was outraged by this. He does not write to Lucilius to denounce the cruelty of the games, though elsewhere he does denounce them. He writes to confess that he himself, sitting there, felt the cruelty entering him. He felt himself becoming the kind of man who could sit at such a spectacle. He felt the standards by which he ordinarily measured a human life slacken, just slightly, in the heat of the crowd's collective wanting. And when he went home, he was, in his own honest account, crueler than he had been. This is the application of the principle in his own life, plainly stated. The wise man, even the wise man, even the man who has written treatises on anger and on the constancy of the sage, is not immune to the crowd's contagion. He must structure his life to avoid unnecessary exposure. He must, Seneca writes, withdraw into himself as much as he can. He must associate with those who will improve him and admit only those whom he can improve. The relationship runs in both directions, or it does not run at all. Consider how Seneca actually lived out this principle, not as a doctrine, but as a daily arrangement. The letters themselves are evidence. He chose Lucilius. He did not write to everyone. He wrote repeatedly and at length to one younger friend, whose mind he could shape, and whose company, even at a distance through letters, refined his own thinking. The selection was deliberate. The relationship was philosophical in the old sense, meaning that it was a relationship in which both parties became more themselves through the encounter, not less. He withdrew physically. The estate at Nomentum, the long walks among the vines, the quiet hours of reading and composition, these were not the luxuries of a tired courtier. They were, in his own framing, the deliberate construction of an environment in which the soul could recover from the damage of the crowd. He writes elsewhere of the importance of solitude, not as a permanent condition, but as a necessary counterweight. Recede in the ipse quantum potes. Withdraw into yourself as much as you can. The Latin verb is reflexive, the action turned back upon the agent. You do not withdraw from the world primarily. You withdraw into yourself. The world becomes manageable only when there is a self that can manage it, and that self is built in solitude, not in company. And yet, and this is the qualification Seneca insists upon, he does not recommend the hermit's life. The seventh letter is clear on this. Inwardly, he writes, all should be different, but our outward face should conform to the crowd. The wise man does not announce his withdrawal. He does not adopt strange dress, strange manners, strange speech. He moves through ordinary life in a way that does not draw attention to itself, and he reserves his inward life for himself and for the few he has chosen to share it with. The point is not to perform philosophy in public. The point is to practice it in private, and to let the public see only what they need to see. This is, one must note, advice consistent with how Seneca himself lived. He did not retreat to a cave. He did not refuse senatorial dress or the customs of his class. He continued, even in retirement, to receive visitors, to manage his estates, to participate in the ordinary fabric of Roman elite life. What changed, in his account, was the inward orientation. The outward man looked like a wealthy senator in semi-retirement. The inward man was carrying on a long, slow conversation with himself and with the books and the friends he had selected as worthy companions in that conversation. We are told by Tacitus that when Nero's order finally came, Seneca received it without surprise and met it with what dignity he could muster. He gathered the friends who were with him. He attempted, in the manner of Socrates, to dictate a final discourse as his veins were opened. The death was prolonged and unpleasant, the old man's blood flowing too slowly, and he had to be moved to a hot bath at the end to hasten the process. But the friends were there, and the conversation was there, and the inward life he had spent his last years constructing was there to be drawn upon. The crowd, the imperial court, the politics of betrayal and survival, none of these had finally entered him so deeply that he could not meet his end as himself. This is what the principle meant in his own life, not an abstraction, a practice, a daily, hourly choice about whom to admit and whom to keep at a distance, what rooms to enter and what rooms to leave, when to speak and when to be silent. The crowd was not for Seneca an enemy to be defeated. It was a condition to be navigated, the way a sailor navigates a current that will, if he is careless, carry him exactly where he does not wish to go. Now let us turn more directly to what the seventh letter is teaching you, not what it taught Seneca, what it is offering to you as you sit listening to it across 19 centuries. The first lesson is the one Seneca states most plainly, and it is the lesson the modern reader is most likely to resist. The crowd is not neutral. The company you keep is not a matter of indifference, something separate from your philosophical or moral progress, something you can manage on the side while you attend to the real work of self-improvement. The company you keep is the work. It is not preparation for the work. It is not adjacent to the work. It is, in a substantial degree, the substance of the work itself, because what you absorb from those around you becomes slowly what you are. This is contrary to a common modern intuition, which holds that the self is sovereign, that we choose our influences, that we can spend our days in any company we please and remain, by some inward act of will, untouched. Seneca's 7th letter says, with the authority of a man who tested the proposition on himself and lost, that this is not so. You are not sovereign over what enters you through your eyes and ears, and through the small social pressures of the rooms you sit in. You can be disciplined about it. You can choose your rooms carefully. But once you are in the room is working on you, and pretending otherwise is the first step toward not noticing what is being done to you. The second lesson is harder. It is the lesson that the harm runs in both directions. Seneca writes, avoid bad company. Such are the people you should admit to your life, those whom you yourself can improve. The process is mutual, for men learn while they teach. This is not, you will notice, a recommendation that you seek the company of the great and the virtuous in order to absorb their virtue passively. It is a recommendation that you enter relationships in which there is real exchange, in which you give as well as receive, in which both parties are made better by the encounter. The crowd is corrupting, partly because the crowd asks nothing of you. It demands no responsibility. It permits you to be one among many, accountable to no one for what you become while you are inside it. The chosen friendship is improving precisely because it does demand. The friend sees you. The friend notices when you slip. The friend is, in the act of being your friend, a constant low-level pressure toward the better version of yourself, and you are the same for him. The third lesson is the one Seneca closes with, and it is the one that is easiest to misread. He cites Democritus, who said that one man is enough audience for him, and he is enough audience for one man. He cites Epicurus, who wrote to a friend, I write this not for the many, but for you. Each of us is enough audience for the other. And then Seneca offers his own version of the same thought. Lay these words to heart, Lucilius, that you may scorn the pleasure which comes from the applause of the majority. Many men praise you, but have you any reason for being pleased with yourself if you are a person whom the many can understand? That last sentence is one of the most severe in the whole correspondence. Have you any reason for being pleased with yourself if you are a person whom the many can understand? Read it slowly. The implication is not that you should become incomprehensible, that you should cultivate obscurity for its own sake, that you should retreat into snobbery or affected difficulty. The implication is that the things that are most worth being are not the things the crowd applauds, because the crowd applauds what it can already see, and what it can already see is by definition not above the crowd's own level. To be praised by the many is to have become legible to the many. To have become legible to the many is to have come down to where the many already stand. The praise itself is the evidence that you have, in some respect, failed. This is a hard teaching, and it cuts against almost every incentive of public life, ancient and modern. The Roman senator was supposed to be applauded. The successful man was supposed to be recognized. Seneca, who had spent decades being applauded and recognized, is telling his younger friend that the applause was the problem. Not that recognition is always wrong, not that one should refuse all praise, but that the applause of the many is, almost by definition, a sign that you have made yourself into something the many can use, can flatter, can absorb into their own collective movement. And what they absorb, they level. The principle, then, is not really about crowds at amphitheaters. It is about the deep structural pressure that human beings exert upon one another simply by being together, in any numbers. The amphitheater was the extreme case, and Seneca chose it precisely because it was extreme. But the same pressure operates in smaller assemblies. It operates in the Senate. It operates at dinner. It operates in the modern equivalents of all of these, which you can name for yourself. The principle is constant. Numbers magnify the pressure, but they do not create it. Even two people, badly chosen, can drag one another down. And the remedy is constant too. Withdraw inwardly, select carefully, speak rarely, read often. Keep one friend at least with whom the exchange runs in the direction of mutual improvement, and treat that friendship as more valuable than any audience of strangers, however large. This is what Seneca did in his last years with Lucilius. It is what the letters are evidence of and what they recommend. So we come to the close of this letter and to the question you may carry with you from it. Seneca did not write the seventh letter as a man who had solved the problem of the crowd. He wrote it as a man who had been defeated by it that afternoon at the amphitheater, and who was confessing the defeat in order to put his friend on guard against the same defeat. This is perhaps the most useful thing about the letter: its honesty. He does not pretend that the wise man stands above the contagion. He admits that he caught it on a single afternoon after years of practice. He went home worse than he had come. The question then is not whether you have escaped the crowd. You have not. No one has. The question is whether you have noticed what the crowd is doing to you. Whether, when you return home from the gatherings of your own life, the ones you cannot avoid and the ones you have chosen, you take any time at all to sit with yourself and ask what has entered you. Whether you can name what has shifted in the hours since you left your own quiet. Whether you can identify the small softenings, the standards loosened by a degree, the judgments now slightly more permissive than they were when you went out. Seneca, in the seventh letter, models the practice. He notices, he writes it down, he confesses it to a friend who will hold him accountable for it. This is not a heroic discipline. It is a small, daily one. It requires only that you be willing to admit, at the end of an evening, that you are not quite who you were at the beginning of it, and to inquire with some honesty in which direction the change has run. If the change has run downward, as it ran for Seneca that afternoon, then you have learned something about that company and that room, which you can apply the next time the invitation comes. If it has run upward, which is rarer but possible, then you have learned something about the friendships worth keeping. Either way, the noticing itself is the discipline. The crowd will continue to do what the crowd does. The only variable is whether you will be paying attention. Consider then, before you sleep tonight, whose company you have kept this day, and what you have brought home from it. Consider whether there is one person in your life with whom the exchange runs in the direction Seneca describes, mutually improving, each enough audience for the other. Consider whether you are that person for anyone else, and if you are not, consider whether you might begin to be.